Somebody at the end of the last panel made the very important point that we need to remember the users. And this panel is about the users, of the European Union. That might sound a sort of slightly unusual way to put it, but what I want the rather stellar panel that I'm standing in the way of right now to discuss is what Brexit potentially means at a political level, so for the political users of the European Union, who are of course its citizens, but also for its businesses, for the people that rely on the economy that the European Union has helped us build for the last 20 to 25 years, and what the implications are of separating that economy in a very, very powerful and significant way. And I'm going to start just with 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, of introduction as a way of teeing up these issues. And I think, needless to say, if you're not already interested in Brexit and you work and live in Brussels, you're probably going to have to get fairly used to it, because this is the elephant in the room. This is a herd of elephants, to some degree, in the room. And I think that if this panel leaves you with anything today, it should be with a sense of just how profound the separation that we are contemplating is going to be. And while everybody understands that obviously there's a hierarchy of political issues in Europe that need dealing with, and Brexit isn't the top of every national list of priorities, the reality is that what the journey that the UK is potentially about to depart on is going to leave behind a very, very different European Union. One of the things I want to talk about with the panel this morning is the notion of political contagion. Brexit has established a new political fact. We had a hint of it in the Grexit crisis over the last couple of years. The Grexit suggested that maybe the EU had a trapdoor at the bottom that you could fall out of. Brexit, potentially, almost certainly, has established the idea that the EU has an exit door. For 6 decades, broadly speaking, we've regarded European integration as monodirectional, as only going in one direction, as a process that, broadly speaking, might slow, it might stall, it might restart, it might be patchy, but fundamentally, it only goes in one direction. That's what the notion of ever closer union, in all its contested forms, actually fundamentally communicates politically. That this is not a choice that you reverse. And the UK appears to be in the position of making precisely that choice, the choice to reverse it. And that's going to create a new political fact for everybody. Europe has an exit door. And if you're a eurosceptic, that fundamentally changes the way you think about your aims. It fundamentally changes the way you think about the evidence that you marshal for the case that Europe is a bad thing. And the UK is going to play, both on the inside and the outside over the next 5 to 6 years, a very important role in shaping the aims and aspirations of those who share the aims of British eurosceptics for creating a slightly different or a fundamentally different European Union. And one of the things I'm going to ask the panel is the extent to which we should regard what's just happened in the UK as fundamentally, idiosyncratically a British phenomenon, or whether there is in fact a European strain of this thinking, already embedded in the politics of the EU, and I think most of us recognize that that's probably the case. But then it's important to understand what's driving it, why it's there, what's distinctly British about the Brexit choice, and what we should be regarding as a European or even a global political phenomena, certainly in the developed world. Then we're going to talk about this reality, which is the reality that the UK is proposing to undertake the largest demerger of economies since the Second World War. For all the talk of Article 218 and the role of the European Commission and DG Trade in negotiating a future bilateral trade arrangement between the UK and the EU, we must not lose sight of an absolutely fundamental fact, which is that what the UK and the EU agree in terms of their future framework is not going to be like any free trade agreement that the EU, or indeed any other developed country or developing country for that matter, has ever agreed. It is a deliberalization. For most of my early career, I advised trade policy makers. And when you advise on trade negotiations, you're dealing with hypothetical futures. You start with the status quo, and you talk about the opportunities of future market opening. If we remove this trade barrier, if they remove that trade barrier, we may see new trade flows here and here and here, and that's probably mutually beneficial. This process is going to be fundamentally different. These trade flows, this economic integration, it already exists, and we are proposing to roll it back. And that completely changes the dynamic, it changes the incentives on both sides, and of course, to state the blindingly obvious, it fundamentally changes the disruption that this will cause to the European and the British economies. And thinking through what that means is going to be a really important part of the process for the next few years. And one of the things I'm going to ask the panel is what some of the potential costs of that disruption might be and how we should factor them into a negotiation on the relationship between the EU and the UK. And of course, just to make the point, this is not a purely economic problem. The EU and the UK are exposed to each other in trade, they're exposed to each other in finance, they're exposed to each other in capital markets, they're also exposed to each other just simply at the level of human interaction. Millions of people from both sides live on the other side. So the process that we are about to start is not just about demerging economies, it's not just the abstraction of demerging markets. This is about how, to some degree, you manage the demerger of a society, of a common society, a human society. Obviously, the EU is going to look different with the UK on the outside. And here's just 4 ways. Clearly, it's going to fundamentally change the balance between the non-Euro and the Euro states. The UK is by far the biggest non-Euro using state in the European Union. To some extent, David Cameron's renegotiation at the end of last year was all about how you manage that disproportionate relationship between the Euro users and the non-Euro users. With the UK on the outside, that little club of non-Euro using states, the little collection of states outside of a possible caucusing of the Euro group, looks a much smaller and much more fragile community, and that's inevitably going to change the dynamic of the Euro group and across a whole range of policies. Britain, of course, for 40 years, has brought a set of policy biases to the way it thinks about the EU, not least on trade. When you take the UK out of the mix in the Council, the way that the EU makes trade policy, the way it thinks about liberalization, they will all change. Capital markets, one of the things I'm going to ask Ann-Kristin about later, is the impact of placing what is unequivocally, you can argue about the detail, but unequivocally the EU's capital for financial services outside the EU. 60% of capital raising in the EU takes place in one form or another, either directly or in the form of back-to-back lending, out of London. Now, what does it mean to try and remove that centre, surgically or less surgically, from the EU? What does it mean for entrepreneurship? What does it mean for innovation? I'm going to ask those questions. And then finally, the budget. You know, the little red calculator at the top there doesn't look like very much, but that's 11 billion euros in net annual payments by the UK into the EU budget. Now, if you're going to try and distribute that 11 billion euros around the existing payers in order to ensure that services or funding or subsidies don't fall, that's an intensely political question. And in fact, anybody who's been following the rerun of the presidential election in Austria will know that the proposition of asking Austrians to pay €1 billion extra euros a year is an intensely political one. So as I say, in many, many ways, far many more than this slide can capture, the EU without the UK is going to make policy differently. It's going to see the world differently. It's going to be economically structured differently. It's going to fund itself and make policy differently. And then finally, this is a way, to some degree, of just kind of bringing this home for a tech audience. Somebody on the previous panel was talking about the possibility of a platforms regulation. Well, this is how the Council broke down, if you use the proxy of the letter on platforms regulation, on that particular issue. And as you can see, the inner circle is the kind of anti-regulation club with the UK in it. The outer circle is the same club with the UK gone. You're way, way, way below any kind of qualified minority or blocking minority. And again across trade policy, commercial policy, economic policy, we're going to find this shift in the dynamic of the Council. The UK is a very, very big state with which has wielded a very, very decisive influence in many areas of European policy making. And with that weight on the outside, the world looks potentially quite different. So, having used those by way of introduction, I'm going to ask the panel to come up and join us. Come on, guys. I think we'll clap at the end. Great, okay. Super. So I'm going to go in the middle, am I? Certain logic to that. Okay, I'd like to, well, maybe I'm going to ask the panelists actually to introduce themselves. I think that's quite a useful way of doing it. If everyone can just give us just literally 20 seconds on who you are and where you're coming from. I'm going to then interrogate the panel for a few minutes, but then I'd like to throw it open to the floor, because I think if this is a panel about remembering the users, that's all of you. And I think the best way to do this actually would be to take your questions. So can we start with...
Thank you so much. My name is Ann-Kristin Achleitner from the Technische Universität München. As was said, I'm a professor for entrepreneurial finance, so I work at the intersection of entrepreneurship and finance. And in that role, or connected to that, I'm also a member of the supervisory board of the German Stock Exchange.
Great.
My name is Tristram Hunt. I'm a lecturer in history at Queen Mary, University of London, but I'm also the Member of Parliament, the Labour Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central, which voted 70-30 to leave the European Union. I was in the 30%.
I'm not sure that's any protection for you here.
I'm C.Grobe. I'm one of the co-founders and COO of FundingCircle. FundingCircle is a digital marketplace for small business loans and the global leader in that area. We are present in 5 countries. We are in the US, in UK, Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. So we are really a global tech business that, of course, has different implications on the regulation where we will talk about later.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Stephan Shakespeare. I'm the founder and CEO of YouGov, which is a online market research group. The biggest market is the US, the UK, followed by Europe, so we're in Paris and Cologne, Berlin, and the Nordics, and Southeast Asia and the Middle East.
Great. Okay. Well, Tristram, I want to start with you. And the reason I want to start with you is because as a British politician, and not least as a British politician from, as you quite appositely point out, a constituency that voted 7-3 to leave the EU. You in many respects have the kind of helicopter view, the view from both the ground, but also I think maybe from a great height of how this debate is playing out. Could you give us your sense of, to the extent that we can identify causes for the Brexit vote, what would they be?
Well, the campaign for Brexit had a very snappy slogan, which was "Take control." And what they brilliantly appealed to was a notion that being part of Europe meant that both in terms, I think, of the sovereignty of the UK, in terms of immigration, and in terms of the impact of globalization, people in Britain did not have control of their lives and communities. And if you break that down into its components, in the last panel we heard about the wonders of people moving between Barcelona and London and Amsterdam. Well, in low-income communities in Britain, which have seen very high levels of migration, particularly over the last 6 to 7 years, there is less enthusiasm for the free movement of people. And that is around the impact on wage levels, particularly for the low-skilled. That is the impact of migration on public services in terms of class sizes, in terms of access to doctors, in terms of access to housing. But it is also about culture and identity. And a sense of the impact of new language, new clothes, new cultures within a community. And around that, a sense of loss. And this speaks to a bigger driver behind it, which is in a sense the winners and losers of globalization. And when you begin to break down who voted Remain and who voted Leave, there is this marked disparity between highly skilled graduates in university towns. There was a candlelit vigil of mourning in Cambridge in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. But in communities which have seen high levels of unemployment, which have seen low wage levels, often coastal towns, Hartlepool, Grimsby, my own constituency of Stoke-on-Trent, there was a sense that they were not gaining from the membership of the European Union, that they have seen their wage levels decline, that they've seen their standard of living decline, and this was a moment of protest. And I think the final thing I would say in terms of the drivers of it, don't think this is just about economic materialism or racism. This is also about a sense of sovereignty. This is also about a very passionate idea that you elect your representatives and you elect your government, and you can, as we say in Britain, throw the buggers out when you've had enough of them. And a feeling that the membership of the European Union did not allow for that. So actually, on the street corner, at the market stalls, when we had the debate about membership of the Union, there was a sophisticated debate about the nature of sovereignty and the nature of representative democracy, which was also part of this conversation. And to my mind, that was the one area of analysis that I would agree with critics of our membership of the European Union. But so I'd think immigration, globalization, sovereignty.
So, I mean, but none of those things sound necessarily idiosyncratically British. I mean, does that suggest perhaps that, that it's easier for this kind of politics to establish itself on this side of the channel? Is it already established, in your view, on this side of the channel?
I think the results we saw in Germany last night, what we're seeing with the Front National in France, what we're seeing in Sweden and Denmark, show that many elements of that anti-immigration sentiment, the sense of the losers and winners of globalization, is there across the continent already. The question is whether defenders of representative democracy are going to defend parliamentary processes or go for referenda. But secondly, there is a different sensibility in Britain as an island nation which had a more complicated relationship with the continent, but also this worrying nostalgia about empire and post-colonialism, and this notion that somehow the Commonwealth would sort of pick up the slack, this notion that our great sort of, Elizabethan buccaneering imperial past would somehow replace our membership of the European Union. And I think there is a particularity about Britain and British identity, which in terms of empire and the legacy of empire, even amongst people who've grown up without any sense of what the British Empire was, has a different feeling in terms of the relationship with Europe.
Do you think there's a particular challenge here for the political left?
Yes, I mean, what we're also seeing...
Sorry, we should point out that Tristram is a Labour MP.
Labour, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And it is Europe, and the European Union and the politics of the European Union is killing, as it were, the traditional social democratic left, and you're swinging either to your Syrizas and Podemos and your sort of anti-austerity populism, or you're swinging to your nationalistic, anti-immigrant populism. And the space for the traditional centre-left in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Denmark, is under intense pressure. I think the combination of bailing out the banks, austerity politics, and the Eurozone has been devastating for centre-left politics.
Great, Tristram, thank you. Stephan, that's the view from the doorstep. Tell us the extent to which that shows up in the numbers or in the focus groups.
Well, first of all, let me say that Tristram has absolutely nailed the description of the issues and the voters, and that is actually extremely rare. It's extremely rare to hear a progressive politician who does not talk about the people who voted for Brexit as ignorant, racist, stupid, and somehow to be ignored. And that is so important if we're thinking about the question of how the EU repairs the situation and avoids contagion, if that's the theme. Then starting with that understanding is the critically important thing, because the campaign that was led by Cameron was the exact opposite. It was all about there's only if we hit them on the head enough with how locusts will eat their babies the day after, and treat them as the idiots they are, which I think was really the attitude behind that campaign, you will get to this point that we're in now. I have a few slides, but I'm not actually going to show most of them. I don't know if there is just the one most important one, which is really just underlining that last comment, which is looking at how people voted in the the Brexit, the referendum, in terms of who they voted for in 2015. And because all of our research is online and uses people that we can track through time, we actually know exactly who they voted for and whether they voted and so on. So the first group, of course, 95% of UKIP voters voted for Brexit. That's not surprising, but even that contains a little story, which is that 5% didn't. And if you're going to win campaigns, which will be very tight, you actually need to understand that group and get that 5%, because that 5% is 1% of the final result, and if you're going to win or lose by 1 or 2%, that really matters. And I'm just going to keep reiterating this point, that the EU's, that people who campaign for the EU typically want to treat all those people as nutters and as nasty, and let's keep them away from us. And even there are 5% that will vote for the EU. So it's very important to understand this. Conservatives, you would understand, 61%, but then the really devastating numbers to the progressive view, which is that 35% of Labour supporters, and I'm sure Tristram would say in Stoke it was considerably higher, and 32% of Liberal Democrats, which is the passionately, absolutely out-and-out pro-EU party, 32% of its supporters voted for Brexit, 20% of Greens. Now, this is perhaps the most extraordinary. So when you look at those columns and see the Brexit voters, you can dismiss some of those people as racists. I don't think many of them are, actually, but you can dismiss a number of them. You can dismiss them as ignorant and stupid. But 20% of people who vote Green, who are absolutely not anti-foreigners, and they're not inward-looking, and they are the most thoughtful and progressive, perhaps if you were to typify them, are voting for Brexit. So this is this is the cultural and intellectual background. The demographic we know, it's older people are more likely, graduates are more likely to vote, older people are more likely to vote out, graduates are more likely to vote in. If you're living in an urban area, you're slightly more likely to vote to stay in. The only other two slides I want to show, or really one slide, we have at the moment a poll going in our relationship with Handelsblatt. We are doing a 12-country poll about contagion, if you like. It actually contains an awful lot of stuff in it. And I can show you the interim numbers. They're not the numbers itself, just some very rough conclusions. I'll just go through this quickly. We don't need any of that stuff. That was in case we ran out of things to talk about. People are overwhelmingly pessimistic about the future of the EU. So we asked them, do you think the EU is, I don't remember the exact phrase, but are you pessimistic or optimistic about whether it will survive and so forth? And they're overwhelmingly pessimistic for all of the countries except for Spain and Poland. There is optimism there, but that's the only place. Everywhere else, it's not only pessimistic, but it's very pessimistic. Secondly, there is significant resistance to EU membership in Sweden, France, Italy, Denmark, Holland, and Finland. And by significant, I don't mean that referenda would necessarily be won there. They probably wouldn't, perhaps not in any of those countries. But it is a really significant group. And this is just to reiterate the same point again, there are lots of people across every single group that want to be out of the EU. They cannot possibly, if you want to win elections, you cannot treat them as if they're just wrong. You have to adapt, think about, because obviously our polling is often used for political campaigning, to truly understand these voters and to talk to them and to communicate with them. Just one thing about predicting what would happen in a referendum. The polls in the UK, before the referendum campaign started, gave a pretty strong prediction of victory for Remain. Not the online polls. We're online because, for good reasons, I think, because online has greater ease of reaching all types of voters, and telephone really only telephone samples contained 50% graduates. You can see how wrong that is and why they were so distorted and were showing 10-20% leads for Remain. But a year ago, Mori actually had a poll saying Londoners would vote 3-1 to stay in. So which is obviously, it was not only much closer, I think it was maybe 60-40, I don't know, it was much, much tighter than that. And this sense that everybody wants to stay in, because the polls show that, I think is deeply suspect. You have to be nervous that in the dynamics of a campaign, those numbers will seriously change. So if you have a referendum, I think all of those countries could theoretically go, and possibly more than that. There is a majority opposition to closer union. We asked them, do you want closer union, do you want it to stay the same, or do you want it to powers to go back to individual countries? The closer union is a tiny splinter for most of those countries. The stay the same is a bit bigger, and bring powers back to countries is the majority everywhere except for Italy, Romania, and Lithuania out of the 12 that we are surveying. These are not, please don't quote these numbers because they are not final. People are still taking the survey, and we still have all of our analytics to do. But for me, this says there is something to be seriously nervous about. There is something as well that people have to adapt to, rather than think how much more can we get the same message across. EU enthusiasts need to change their game.
To what extent do you think the perception of the consequences of the British choice are likely to play out in these numbers over the next couple of years? I mean, to what extent do you think public opinion is going to be driven by perception of the UK's costs or benefits?
Well, one of the things that, of course, really influences people's thinking and how they frame the way that they see an issue is what they regard as mainstream opinion and what they regard as crazy opinion. And for years, for example, people who didn't want to join the euro were considered to be nutty, and swivel-eyed was the phrase, you know, people's eyes were moving about because they're not quite sane. That changed, of course, when there were problems, and it was obvious that you could stay outside the euro and actually do really well. Then the message was you had to stay in the euro or else everything's going to go crazy. If you see the UK actually, of course, they're not out. We're not out, so that gives a false impression. I realize that, but the emotional quality of a major, sophisticated country voting to leave and actually continuing as normal clearly starts to make that option sound palpable. Locusts will not come and eat your babies. It is something that it becomes much more malleable to...
Do you think that becomes a factor in the politics of the exit negotiation itself? I mean, do you think there's a material risk or possibility that perception of a political contagion risk shapes the way other EU states manage the UK's transition out of the EU?
Yes, I think it's bound to, because of course the people doing this are subject to public opinion as well. Yeah. By the way, we asked the question, should the UK get a deal? Overwhelmingly the view is yes, but only if certain conditions are met, like payments and free movement. Right. It doesn't help very much on either side. So yes, it's bound to affect those negotiations.
Well, I mean, and that's a great inflection point to some extent between the politics and the economics. Because if the situation that I described at the beginning, which is a situation in which we're not having an abstract negotiation about future market access or future market operational rights, we're having a very concrete, exceptionally risky discussion about how we pull apart two comparatively integrated economies. If the politics are going to dictate that has to be painful, then that implies painful economics. And one area of thinking about that is capital markets. Yeah. So maybe you can just give us, Ann-Kristin, just a bit of insight in what the prospect of, in the technical jargon, separating the single European liquidity pool means for raising money for companies, entrepreneurship.
Thank you. It might seem far-fetched to go, from the political discussion we just had to financial markets. As you said, I think it's very close. We should bear in mind if we cut it in two parts, we have less than those two parts before. I will come back to that. But first, if we step back for 3 steps and we take what you said, at the root of the decision of the Brexit decision, we have economic reasons. And it was already clear before we had the Brexit that people felt insecure, they were unhappy because they were having fear of jobs and all this. And in order to rebuild the industry, which is very obvious, or to have a startup culture, to have a startup ecosystem, you would need capital markets. It was mentioned this morning that, in Europe we grow companies to a certain size, but then it stops. We don't really build big companies, and one of the major reasons for that is also that we have smaller capital markets. Now, if you look at the discussion, you will see that although we have smaller capital markets here, which are important to foster innovation and growth, that at the same time we are deleveraging, we're having regulation on banks, which means we will have less bank lending, which would mean capital markets are ever more important, you know? And that would be important for the existing industry. If you think of Industry 4.0 to rebuild, they're important for growth companies that have a different pattern from risks, so they would need debt and equity. And they're important for startups, which is something that is very often forgotten, because if we think of startups, we think of growing little startups, but we forget the end, that you will only have investors if those startups can exit, you know, or if they can grow. And if they don't find this here in our capital markets, what actually happens, they either don't grow or they go abroad, what we have seen a lot in the innovation field. People go off when they're rather young, or they go off when they're IPO, but then those companies are lost. And for that reason, it was felt that it would be a good idea for the stock exchanges to merge in a global scenario where stock exchanges are merging anyway. So we are in a competition with the United States on one side and Asia on the other. So it's important to have the funds here to boost innovation. So before the Brexit, you had the negotiations between the German, the London Stock Exchange, which would include Milano, and the shareholders, even after the Brexit, voted that they would love to have that, because the idea is with platforms that 1 and 1 is not 2, but the more, it's a typical platform situation, the more investors you have, the more companies you have, and the more companies, the more investor interest you get. For example, you have several hundred, I think 480 or something, growth companies that would be there. So I think we should really be aware, moving forward, it's now with the European Commission, that if we cut those ideas and we don't move forward, what we actually do is we don't only limit our capital markets, but we limit our real economy. And if it was ever important to fuel the real economy, it's right now. Yeah?
Short term and long term, in your mind, is there an alternative to the UK as a core, kind of cornerstone of the capital markets of the European Union?
You will see a movement now that some things are shifting, etc. But London has been an important capital market for a long time, for historical and a lot of other reasons, and it will stay very important. So you know, I hope for both sides, you know, from London, but also for the European countries, it's very, you know, that we somehow really managed to set up a new regulatory system that keeps as much alive. Because if we kill it, as I said, and cutting it into 2 slices means you have less, because you have less liquidity, which means you have different pricing.
Why is that? Why does dividing the liquidity up mean less?
Because, for example, pricing, you're interested if you're going to the capital markets to get a good, you know, to have a good pricing mechanism, and if you have less offer and less demand, very simply, you know, it's more difficult.
So you're saying it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a question of just migrating all that liquidity from London and dividing it around other
because you're
centres.
spiraling down. You will have migration changes, but there's a good reason, you know, that these things are clustered, you know. So I think even if there will be migration to other countries, and, you know, Paris is fighting it for Frankfurt, and you have the island debate, still London will stay important to an important.
But it's going to raise presumably it's going to raise some really difficult issues of regulatory politics, because of course at the moment we have a single regulatory perimeter. London's capital markets are inside the remit of the single European rulebook for financial services. The question will be, I suppose, can London continue to play, or the UK, the wider UK, continue to play that role outside of the regulatory perimeter, and on the basis of what kind of arrangement?
Yeah, I think that exactly as you say. I mean, it's not only banking that is regulated, other industries too, but that will be very important that we find a way how to do it, and that we shouldn't think about what I hear. I mean, you might comment on that, but I hear this logic: it's real economy versus the financial sector, you know, and where you make compromises, and this is simply not true. Those are not 2 different sectors, you know. Sure. They are very strongly intertwined. I mean, you might have heard it as that is my impression, at least in Britain. You're discussing about where you would make compromises and not, and you can't see it that distinct.
I mean, part of the conversation in the referendum was the City of London, the financial services industry doing very well over the last 10 to 15 years, alongside manufacturing decline, and a sense of an overmighty London. And so there's an element of, well, if we lose a bit of London's might, but South Wales or the Northeast do better on exports because of a lower pound. That's part of the deal. And I don't think there's an appreciation of, A, the total dependence of our public services on funding from the City of London, but also how intertwined it is. But the grievance towards London, the power of London, and the financial services was a background to the referendum debate.
But I think what's really interesting about what you're saying, Ann-Kristin, is the fact that we do need to also see this from the continental European side. That it's very difficult to find a major piece of lending to a European company that doesn't ultimately start with a back-to-back loan from a London bank. And the idea that this is simply that this is a simple choice for the EU27 with respect to the dependence on London in the short and long term means that we're probably still not thinking hard enough about the compromises that might be worth making to keep some elements of the status quo in place, precisely because at the end of that long chain is the real economy.
Exactly, and I think, we are DLD here, so we're talking about platform companies all the time. So you just have to take the logic that you know from platform companies to the capital markets and just cut them in, in two sides, and then you know exactly what I mean, you know?
Right. Well, which is a perfect segue to Mr. Funding Circle here. Okay, Christian, give us the view from a rapidly growing fintech. The prospectus you've had for the last 10 years is a developing digital single market. We are now potentially proposing to put a rift in that digital single market. What does that mean for a business like yours?
I think in the end, it's exactly the same effect that was described as for capital markets, because when you build a fintech that is globally, when you build a platform, then of course you need scale. Yeah. And you need addressable market. And if you only have a 60 million market to address instead of like 350 million market, that is of course different. And also when we look at it from a German perspective or when we look at it from a Spanish perspective, you need that big single market to address. So when we look at it, we basically see three buckets that are currently evolving. One is immediate repercussions, and number 2 and 3 is more like midterm repercussions that we are discussing in our contingency planning and that we are fearing. So number 1 is on the investor side and on the capital market side, we already discussed that. So when you look at our marketplace as a company that is bringing together investors with companies who are seeking loans, then of course we need many investors who are willing to put debt capital into countries across Europe. And of course, that is much easier if you have a common reference ground on the regulatory side and where you can estimate on what your regulation that will be built going forward. Yeah. And so what we are experiencing when we are talking to institutional investors, that they are saying, yes, great company, great traction, but of course there's a lot of risk, so we wait until it plays out how the regulatory rules will be set up, that we keep on investing. Right. Right. We need that kind of fuel.
So you've seen that kind of concrete anxiety among the investor base and the LPs already?
Yeah, I just talked, just recently, a week ago, I talked to one fund manager who's putting together a big fund for European P2P investments. And he already had a commitment about a couple of $100 million. And he said 2 of investors bailed out and said, hey, if you want to invest in the UK and not only do continental Europe, I don't want to give you money because it's too unsecure from the regulatory perspective. So we are seeing that this kind of flighty money is already pulling out. Yeah.
But it does seem to me that it raises some really profound questions. I mean, to some extent, retail banking as a general European phenomena has never really taken advantage of the single market. Investment banking, broadly speaking, has, not least because of the financial services rulebook. But fintech, in many ways, was an industry made for the combination of the digital single market and capital markets union. And Brexit, in that respect, looks potentially highly disruptive. So when you hear, when you see policymakers in the EU suggesting that really this is an opportunity to migrate some of this business into continental Europe, Stockholm, other places, do you think that's short-sighted? I mean, do you think there's a case for a slightly medium-term, longer-term strategy of actually trying to preserve some of the potential of the digital single market between the UK and the EU?
we definitely should try this, right? Because it's about building big companies, and you will only build big companies when you remain or keep Britain in that kind of single market union in what form ever. So you already see the pull that you have the capitals in Germany and France, where you have the ministers responsible for digital businesses, that they are trying to pull all the startups out of London, and they are now trying to play that zero-sum game and saying, hey, you've been based in London, now the regulatory framework is much more insecure, why not move to Berlin or to Paris, because there's also a vibrant startup scene, why not do this? And I think if we starting to play these games, it's a downside for everyone, and we will never build like companies in the same size as China can, as the US can, because the market is still small.
Well, I mean, you make a really interesting point and a really interesting analogy of the analogy between the liquidity effect and the network effect, and these things both suffer when you try to divide them in half.
Exactly, never mind. Just underline what you said. You know, it's not us fighting between us two, but it's the competitors coming from American nation.
Right.
Exactly the same situation there. That we should never forget.
And just, I mean, one final, you know, you're on this panel, you're the, I mean, obviously Deutsche Börse is a big taker of European regulation, but you've been a taker of Fintech regulation for the, you know, for the last few years. Do you see the EU making digital Fintech regulation differently with the UK outside? I mean, I realize it's a sensitive issue, but you know, the EU's view, for example, on US tech, do you think it looks different with the UK not around the table?
It will look different. I mean, at the moment, there is basically no EU regulation on fintech, right? When we go out, we have regulatory regimes in each of the single countries. So we have a different regulatory regime we are facing in Spain, then in Germany, then in the Netherlands, then in the UK.
Right.
But going forward, there will be a unified regulatory regime for the EU. And of course, once Britain is out of that, we will lose a liberal voice there. Because when you look what happened in Britain over the past years with the FCA being very much helping to build those businesses in a very like long-term view, that voice, of course, we will miss.
Yeah. So in fact, I mean, it does seem to me one of the challenges is going to be how you keep the UK's voice in a constructive way in EU policy making, even if the UK is on the outside, and that's an inevitable part of being two big jurisdictions, you know, sitting next to each other and that closely, you know, engaged with each other. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to open the floor to some questions, if we have some. Is there a roving mic, or if you're from somewhere in particular and you've got a vested interest, could you introduce yourself? Yeah, well, no, go on. Why don't you just stand up and shout?
Thank you, Norway and Iceland, or you out. And who is out in Europe? Who are the other countries who are out of the EEA or the European Union? That's Turkey, Macedonia and Montenegro, and Russia for you. Well, you want to create a fourth way. How can you actually... So let me just come to my point, if you don't mind.
Let's ask a question.
You want to create a fourth way. But what is the alternative, gentlemen? What is the alternative? This is not going to be possible if you don't want to have the freedom of people in the UK. Well, just forget about the single market. And you know what? I think the 28 member states of the European Union are delighted that the UK burgers off from the European Union because you are such a pain in the bottom. Honest. You are a pain in the bottom. Okay, and you're talking about doing referendums in other countries. What do you think about? Cameron was a disgrace. He did 2 referendums in his term. I mean, 2 referendums in his term, always like just, gambling on the future of the UK, and using a lot of very just a lot of emotions for the UK people. I think that's just a disgrace.
Well, there's clearly
anyway, what is the
there's-
alternative, gentlemen? Go for it.
I think there's clearly a lot of emotion on both sides. I think, to be honest, the point that the point we've been trying to make, actually, the panelists have all made in their own way, is that it may prove impossible to square the circle that you've just described. It may prove impossible to find some political way. The circle. Clearly, the relationship between the UK and the EU is now an intensely political question. I think all the panel is really trying to say is there are going to be economic consequences to the choices we make. And it may be, there is, I think, an important distinction, obviously, between being a participant in the single market, accepting all of the things that come with that, with respect to freedom of movement, budgetary contributions, legal transposition, all of those things. But there is an alternative with respect to a trade relationship with the EU, and there are lots of models of how to do that. And given our unique economic integration, it's a very practical question about what we can make work politically and economically for the two sides. I don't hear a lot of naivety, to be honest, on the panel on that question.
Yeah,
Hang on. Let's let the panel speak.
It seems to me a very strange conversation to have, because the conversation about whether this is the right or wrong decision is not our decision. That's happened. Surely the question is, do you want the same threat to occur to you in France or in Holland or in Denmark or in Sweden? There's no point in saying, I'm a lawyer, I'm right. You may be right. You may be 100% right. I don't think Tristram or I are defending the decision. In fact, I know that we're not defending the decision. But the discussion is, how do we avoid contagion? How do we avoid, somebody who makes a bad decision has made that decision. There's no defense of it.
The right question is how to avoid that UK doesn't actually go to the fringes of Europe. That is the real question, people. How do we manage to get the UK still in Europe, despite the crazy bargain that you want to strike with Europe, which is never ever going to happen?
But my assumption...
How do we make sure that the UK doesn't get to the fringes of Europe? Because right now, you are going on a collision course.
But that is not what we're discussing, is it? What we're trying to discuss...
Okay, fine. Problem with immigration. You're going nowhere with that woman. There's no good leadership in the UK at the moment. You will see in 2 years. When are you going to trigger Article 50, by the way, guys? When are you going to trigger it?
Well, I hesitate to say that that's not a decision for anybody on the panel.
In the meantime,
Okay.
you are being left out of all the decisions
Yep.
from the EU. That's a problem.
Absolutely, and that was precisely the point, actually, that we were trying to make about how the EU looks different with the UK peripheralized or outside. Are there any other? Can we have another question, maybe?
No.
There's a question at the front.
The only way to avoid the final Brexit would be, in my opinion, a second referendum. Do you think it will be possible to have a second referendum?
Well, let's put that to the unfortunate politician on the panel.
It is possible, but I don't think it's realistic. I think there's a stronger case, because I think the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, I don't think she's got much of a plan. I don't think they've got much of a strategy. Exactly as your criticism suggests, there isn't a vision of how to manage this. There are all sorts of contradictions. I think she will get bogged down in the sand of this quite quickly. And what I see is a chance that we will have to have a general election which puts, as it were, the Article 50 strategy to the people. And at that point, in a sense, you're having almost a rerun of the conversation whereby other political parties will say, well, either actually we would like to pursue, the Norway model, or we would like to pursue remaining in the European Union if Article 50 hadn't been triggered. So I think you could have that conversation through a general election. I think it would be doubtful to a second referendum. And if we did do a second referendum, which is what kind of we're doing in the Labour Party at the moment, you often come back with an even stronger result to the initial one. Just to correct my friend, this was David Cameron's third referendum, not just his second. And because he'd won the other two, because he'd won the general election, he thought he could skim his way through this one. And it was a disastrous decision.
Yeah.
There's a question at the front here.
Yeah, only a short one. Firstly, we have to accept the decision of the UK people, and it's not us from Europe to ask for Article 50, it's UK to ask for Article 50, and they don't, and as long as they are not even able to describe how they want to leave European Union, because what we are doing here is looking in a glass bowl where we see only grey or almost nothing, because we do not even know the conditions UK want to leave. And to be honest, Switzerland is not in the same position as Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland is. Switzerland has no access to European financial markets, but we have freedom of workers, for example. So Switzerland has already a fourth way. We have special agreements around about 150 between European Union and Switzerland. So there are a lot of possibilities, but it's not us to decide that. It's firstly UK to ask for, and secondly then to negotiate whether that is possible or not, in relation to that what we have as existent and what could be created newly. And therefore, I really appreciate the discussion, but to be honest, the markets will not wait. Yeah. The markets will decide on their way. And the markets will decide as long as we don't know, we go somewhere where we know what's going to happen. So my question is, how do you avoid that this economical disaster, which has now started in the United Kingdom, can be avoided, taking into account that UK is not able to deliver any answer how to deal with its leaving process after the referendum. Thanks.
Stephen?
Well,
Sorry.
yeah.
I would just like to make one point that actually a Swiss friend of mine pointed to when I spoke to him, which really made me think also on the panel now. I mean, we're talking about the BREXIT contagion. So, I mean, the Brexit was decided. And if we try to prevent a contagion, we have to think about what we are doing now, because we're spending so much time discussing the British situation. And you pointed out to the fact it's not a British movement, but we see it all over. We saw the votes yesterday. So the really important point is to make clear it was not only a refugee issue, it was also a very deep-rooted economic situation, insecurity that will be worse moving forward with all the changes we're going to have in the industry. So we should rather now, spend much more time discussing what we can do better in the EU. That's why I mentioned capital markets, innovation policy, whatsoever. To really change the situation and that way preventing contagion in other countries to go the same way.
But I mean, I assume that our panelists would agree with the proposition that to some extent the markets have already made a judgment on the level of uncertainty that the vote creates, and both sides will pay the price for that, until such certainty as we can hope for is re-established.
But so far, I mean, markets seem to be pretty optimistic, right? If you look at stock markets, so it wasn't as bad as everyone would have figured when the decision was announced. So I think in the way...
Well, you have to be quite careful with that. The sterling has fallen by about 15%. So
that's true. But apart from that, I mean, it's a very limited effect. And if you really look at the other you would have expected that all the indices will go down in Germany and all the other countries, and it's not happening, I think, because the markets are betting that we will try to find a deal that will be positive for everyone.
Well, I suspect that's probably right. I mean, there is an element of phony war about the current situation, I think, and 2017 is going to, I suspect, inject a new element of volatility.
Yeah, but if we don't take 1 year, we take a time span of 10 years, And I think the capital markets haven't decided on that yet. Yeah. That was what I meant, and I think you were nodding at some.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're out of time. So emotions on both sides notwithstanding, I would like to ask you all to thank the panel.